environment are made tangible when we see pictures like this, much more so than they are when we just see the figures of per pupil learner allocations and things like that. This is the spending allocations in 1994. So at the time of the transition, you've got children in the Western Cape getting more than twice as much money as children in the Eastern Cape, and this is even after some changes that have already taken place in per learner allocations. By the time you get to 2010, 2011, you've got huge changes in resources that are equalized across the provinces, something that Stephen and Panyaza both mentioned. However, you've still got a situation where, this is just to show one of the outcomes, where it's true, as Panyaza said, that South Africa has got 98%, for example, of grade 6 students that are enrolled, but just having high access is not a goal in and of itself, right? The reason why we want children in school is so that they can learn. And what this does is it shows you a corrected estimate of all of these countries, not just of enrollment, but of how many kids can actually read for meaning. Are they literate? And you can see that in South Africa, which is the red bar there, although 98% of children are enrolled in school, only 71% of them are actually literate. Only 71% of these grade 6 students can actually read for meaning. This is compared to countries like Kenya and Swaziland at the top end, which have much higher rates of children that are literate. And this is correcting for access. This is taking access into account. And the reason why this is particularly striking is when you look at how much money we spend per pupil. Something which Stephen did highlight. We're spending 5 times as much per student in Kenya, and yet might have much lower educational outcomes, literacy and numeracy outcomes. This is just one of, we could talk about TIMS, PILS, SACMEC, NSCS, ANA, verification, ANA, matric outcomes. We can talk about all of these things. This is just sort of one example. To show you, as both of the previous speakers mentioned, you've got a huge section of government expenditure that goes to education. It's the largest single line item in the budget, and the majority of that, 78%, of this is going to teacher salaries. And I think anyone that's had any involvement with the unions will realize that that's not really something which the government has control over, that tomorrow they can say, oh, we're actually only going to allocate 60% to teachers because we want to allocate this other money somewhere else. That's not the way that it works. So the vast majority of funding that the government has isn't actually malleable. It's not possible to change the allocation of that funding into different areas. But it's really important to remember that the vast majority is going to, it's around 4% of GDP. That's going to teacher salaries, essentially, personnel expenditure. The motivation for increasing resources, I think this is an important distinction which isn't always made, even by Equal Education, who are the ones that are sort of trying to push for the increased minimum norms and standards and the eradication of undignified schooling environments. You have a basic dignity rationale which has a human rights, ethics, constitution. The reason why children should not have to go to a school that does not have toilets has primarily nothing to do with whether or not they can learn well in that environment. It's a dignity issue. There are arguments to be made on achievement as well. In other words, if you provide water, electricity, sanitation, etc., and provide a conducive learning environment, yes, it is probable that learning outcomes will improve. But the motivation for providing those things isn't primarily achievement focused. The primary motivation for providing children with the most basic forms of infrastructure like water, electricity, and sanitation is a human dignity reason. We not need to motivate that with achievement. And that's why I think the minimum norms and standards is really important, and the work that Equal Education is doing in promoting and forcing that to come to the top of the agenda so that we don't see those schools that you saw earlier is actually extremely important work. Not necessarily dictatorial dictates to the government. The second issue here is that there are motivations around learning achievement and trying to improve learning outcomes, and this is some of the things which Stephen mentioned, where we need more research on the causal impact of certain initiatives. We've got loads of teachers that have been on training. We have no idea if that did anything. There was never an impact evaluation that said they went on this week of course, this week that developed number concepts in foundation phase, and now we know that they actually know number phase or number concepts better and are able to teach it more proficiently. We cannot say that. Why? Impact evaluations were not done. We spent billions on teacher development. We don't necessarily have much to show for it as far as being able to prove that these teachers are more competent teachers. And following on from that, allocating more money to teacher development in the absence of evaluations and proving that these resources are actually yielding positive outcomes is not actually going to do that much. So Stephen mentioned that in South Africa we have a very weak link, as in a lot of countries, between increased expenditures and improved educational outcomes. We don't usually allocate new resources based on evidence. Often it's based on policy fads. It could be based on social dictates from the population or whatever it is. It's not necessarily evidence driven, which is problematic. Some of the issues which I think would be nice to talk about in the break is things like allocating additional amounts of money to grade R. What is the quality of grade R? Expanding an additional year when we don't have measures of quality. Is that really what we need to be doing? LTSM and workbooks. And also libraries and laboratories. My personal take, which we can come back to in the questions, is that I don't think it should all be lumped into one minimum norms and standards. Water, electricity, sanitation, libraries, laboratories, everything will happen by 2030. There should be a sort of phased approach. Phase 1, the absolute basics, water, sanitation, electricity, and some kind of a dignified building. Phase 2, libraries and laboratories. And I think that if you try and lump all of that together, it's a misunderstanding of the capacity constraints that government has, as well as the resource constraints of providing libraries and laboratories. And then also nutrition programs and whether or not those should be extended to high schools. I think that there's a lot of literature which suggests that nutrition is a really important part of improving learning outcomes and sort of quite low-hanging fruit. I've used this picture. I think it's quite a helpful illustration to show that although we do have pro-poor allocation of resources, Stephen did show that for quintile 5 students, because of the top-up of parental resources and fees, we actually still have a very unequal distribution of resources, that children that can attend quintile 5 schools, that can attend Model C schools, have much more resources available to them than quintile 1 schools. And we should talk about things like how do we measure the quintiles? Are the quintile system as they are currently formulated the best way of allocating these resources? A lot of people suggest that the difference between quintile 1 and quintile 3 schools is there's no difference. Why is it that there are these allocations? In some provinces they don't actually make the distinction between quintile 1, 2 and 3. I know in Gauteng they allocate the same proportions based on those 3 quintiles because they realize that it is quite an artificial distinction. We should talk about the allocation of financial resources as one thing, but the allocation of human resources, of quality teachers. Where are teacher quality? Where is it concentrated? It's concentrated in the best schools. And currently there are no incentives, if you're a good teacher sitting in a Model C school in Gauteng, to go and teach in a township. Or if you're in the Western Cape, there are no incentives to suggest that the best teachers should be teaching in the most deprived regions. And there are innovative developing countries that are experimenting with this, providing increased teacher salaries, sort of 150% of the baseline if you're willing to go and teach in underprivileged, particularly resource-constrained areas. And that's why I've said there, I think we need to start thinking about those kinds of things. How do we not just allocate financial resources in a pro-poor way, but given that we think that teachers are the most important element of the schooling system, how do we get good teachers into bad schools or underperforming schools? So I think there's 3 important distinctions here, and these 3 things are often spoken about interchangeably. There's the allocation of resources, which happens at national level, at provincial level. Then you can have an increase in that. Let's say that they allocate another 2 billion rand to resources for the Eastern Cape. There's a difference between an allocation of an additional 2 billion rand and another 2 billion rand on the ground. A contractor who's building a school says, I now have additional funds available to me. So there's the first 2 cogs there. Increased allocation of resources versus increased resources on the ground. In other words, realized resources. And we know that provinces have differential ability to convert allocated resources into realized resources on the ground. And I think there's too much talk about, we've equalized the allocation of resources, but the capacity to actually utilize those resources is vastly different between Limpopo and Gauteng, or between the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape. So that even if you allocate 1 billion to Western Cape, 1 billion to the Eastern Cape, the amount of resources that reach the child on the ground are very different between those 2 provinces. And there are studies that show this in South Africa. And then lastly, the link between increased resources on the ground and improved student outcomes. We shouldn't be talking about increased resource allocations to education as if that's a goal in and of itself. It's not. The reason why we allocate additional resources to education is to improve outcomes or for basic dignity approaches. If Checkers or Pick and Pay said, oh look, we've doubled our costs. We've doubled our costs from this year to the next year, or General Motors, we would be like, why are you telling us that you've doubled your costs? We care about your profit. We care about, yes, you've doubled your costs, but you've tripled your output. That's great. We don't care that you've doubled your costs. Likewise, when we hear these, oh, we're allocating another 50 billion rand to education over the next so many years, we say that's wonderful, but we care about outcomes, not just about allocations. We need to start measuring what's important, which is learning outcomes, which haven't necessarily changed all that much. So I think these are some of the things which cause breakdowns in these cogs. So one is corruption and inefficiency. I think we've had quite a lot of talk from the public protector, which explains that due to a lack of accountability and a sort of ineptitude, a culture of impunity where people aren't held accountable for how they are using public resources, means that you can allocate resources, but those resources aren't realized on the ground for a variety of reasons that relate to inefficiency and corruption. Secondly, even if the resources do make it to the ground, even if you manage to allocate money to textbooks, the textbooks actually reach the classroom, you've got a lack of capacity to actually utilize those resources to lead to positive outcomes, positive learning outcomes. It's not just that an additional resource in your classroom is actually automatically going to produce students that now know how to do fractions just because you have a mathematics workbook in the classroom. You actually need the capacity to use that workbook. You need to know how to calculate fractions yourself, for example, as a teacher. Secondly, you also have things like a lack of accountability. Now, and these are the two concepts that I want to talk on for the last 10 minutes or so that I have, is you have capacity issues and you have accountability issues. Capacity, as I understand it, is the ability to do your job description. If you're a teacher, it's teaching. If you're a district official, if you're a subject advisor, it's helping the people in schools on maths if you're a maths subject advisor. If you're a provincial person that's calculating allocations of textbooks, it's whether or not you can actually do that. Do you have the skills to use Excel, to manage procurement, to manage the delivery of the textbooks, etc. It's capacity issues. Accountability, broadly defined, is consequences for non-performance. In other words, are there any consequences if you do not do what you were meant to do? And the problem in South Africa is that there rarely are consequences. We use the example of the Limpopo textbook crisis, where I think it was one low-level clerk has been disciplined as a result of this, that has at least come into the public. Now, do we think that this one low-level clerk was the person that was responsible for procurement, distribution, delayed ordering? There are a variety of things, and yet it doesn't feel like, at least from the public's perspective, that there was sufficient accountability for that kind of situation. We can also talk about things like the Eastern Cape, the lack of accountability for resources. So this is a broad conceptual framework which I'll go through quickly. You have these two ideas. One is accountability without capacity, and the other one is capacity without accountability. In other words, in both situations, it's one or the other. Elmore, this is in the United States, he explains that accountability systems and incentive structures, it doesn't matter how well they are designed, if the organization does not have the capacity to respond, it's not going to help. Why? Because accountability systems can't mobilize resources that schools don't have. And Lovelace, on the same topic, he says, we cannot just rely on incentives. We can't just think that giving ANA results to parents necessarily is going to motivate change, and this is like the silver bullet that's going to change things. And as Lovelace says, what exactly should an educator in a failing school do tomorrow that they do not do today to produce more learning? What should a failing student do tomorrow that they do not do today to improve their learning outcomes? If I'm a teacher that lacks content knowledge, what am I meant to do? There's not a lot of options that I have, and that's a capacity issue. Then you have an accountability issue. So this is Nick Taylor at NEDU, where he says that accountability measures provide motivation and direction to support measures. They identify capacity shortcomings and establish outcome targets. They set in place incentives and sanctions which motivate and constrain teachers and managers to apply the lessons that they've learned on training courses. Without these, he uses the example of saying it's like pushing a piece of string. It's not going to go anywhere unless you have both capacity and accountability. So now this is sort of me summarizing because I only understand things visually. This is my sort of understanding of how this works. So the size of the bubble here is the size of the red bubble there is the amount of accountability in the system. The amount of capacity in the system is represented by that green bubble. Now the reason why I've labeled the overlap as being improvement is because it's only when teachers have the capacity to respond to an accountability system, as well as the incentives and pressure to actually utilize the capacity that they do have, will there be an improvement. Okay, this is sort of my theory here that's based on quite a lot of evidence in the literature. So we could go with a capacity-only improvement. In other words, there's no improvement in accountability, only an increase in capacity. And we can see that there's this big increase, perhaps it's teacher development, perhaps it's additional resources, whatever it is. But notice that the size of the improvement has stayed the same. It hasn't increased. In other words, there's no additional reason why I need to utilize what I learned on that training course. I come back and there's still problems around teacher absenteeism, there's still problems around we're only teaching for 2.5 hours of the day, these kinds of things. Similarly, if we don't look at capacity, if we only look at accountability, we try and increase the amount of pressure on teachers, but they don't actually have the capacity to do anything. That's an example of the accountability bubble expanding, but the size of the improvement is still the same. In other words, if I don't have the capacity to respond to these new accountability systems, what exactly am I meant to do? So you've got these two situations. One, the top left is just expanding capacity, bottom right is just expanding accountability, neither of which, in theory, if we believe the sort of conceptual model here, is going to lead to an improvement. What we need is for there to be an increase in both accountability and capacity. And why is that? It's because only when schools have both the incentive to respond to an accountability system, as well as the capacity to actually respond to it, should we think that there will be an improvement. And too often you have economists that are just saying, we just need more accountability, we just need more accountability. Or you have government or educationists that just said, we just need more capacity, we just need more capacity. Meanwhile, what the literature is suggesting is that only when you have both of those things are we actually going to see an improvement. And this is sort of part of the paper which was written for the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, was sort of motivating that these two sides need to talk to each other and we need to align both of those systems. Align the systems of accountability and support so that we don't end up with a situation like we have for the last 20 years where it's just been a focus on one or the other as opposed to trying to integrate the two. So I think the conclusion is we need to ensure that public funding is actually pro-poor. In other words, that it actually reaches the kids on the ground in a quintile 1 rural school in the Eastern Cape. Are they getting the proper allocation of resources that they should have? Financial resources on the one hand, human resources on the other. We think that teachers are really important. Why is it that the poorest students have the weakest teachers? And we have evidence to show these. These are not just sort of throw out statements. We have, if you look at the SUCMEC teacher tests, the teachers with the highest content knowledge are concentrated in the wealthiest schools. As just one indication. We need to understand whether the motivation for expanding resources is a human dignity motivation or is it because we need to improve learning outcomes. The reason why that's important is that it has different implications for what you expect as a result of this thing. We should not expect that providing water and sanitation to schools is miraculously going to improve their literacy outcomes. I think that it will, partially for reasons that don't have to do with water and sanitation. It's got to do with things around the dignity of the school. And I have to respectfully disagree with Mr. Lesufi that I do think that a school might need to get resources before the community. And you do find this in other examples in African countries where the school is prioritized and education is prioritized as being the most important institution in the community, and therefore there might need to be a prioritization of resources to the school before the community, as one example. We also need to ensure that additional resources are allocated based on evidence, things like the impact assessment which Stephen talked about, rather than just anecdote, rather than just being dictated to by an interest group or by something where they do not have rigorous research that says this particular resource, this particular textbook, this particular teacher training development, we know that it has an impact, and not rolling out to the entire province before we know whether or not this thing actually works. Because in most instances, we have proof that shows that it doesn't work based on all the evidence in the past. And lastly, this rationale that we need not just one or the other of either capacity or accountability, but both. And until you have that overlap, we shouldn't expect additional resources to yield outcomes. And that was sort of the rationale behind it. Thanks.